White House agreeing to release a redacted version of the Democratic memo. The document, drafted by ranking House Intelligence Committee member Adam Schiff, serves as a rebuttal to the memo authored by Chairman Devin Nunes and argues that the FBI's surveillance of the Trump campaign was justified. Schiff releasing a statement reading, "Our extensive review of the initial FISA application and 3 subsequent renewals failed to uncover any evidence of illegal, unethical, or unprofessional behavior by law enforcement, and instead revealed that both the FBI and DOJ made extensive showings to justify all 4 requests. It is unfortunate that the weekend release of the Democratic memo by the White House was delayed beyond what was necessary and to the advantage of those seeking to mislead the American public." Still, Nunes is standing by his original memo. The congressman was speaking at CPAC earlier today as news broke of the second memo's release.
We wanted it out. We want it out because we think it is clear evidence that the Democrats are not only trying to cover this up, but they're also colluding with parts of the government to help cover this up. What you're not going to see is anything that actually rejects what was in our memo.
President Trump also reacting to the memo's release, tweeting just a short time ago, "The Democrat memo response on government surveillance abuses is a total political and legal bust. Just confirms all of the terrible things that were done. So illegal." Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge joining us from Washington now. Catherine, if you could bring us, you've been poring over this document throughout the day. You did a fabulous time breaking it all down for us earlier today. What are the main highlights?
Okay, so the main highlights in the Democrats' memo, Molly, is that there was no spying on the Trump campaign. They say that when they got this surveillance warrant for the Trump campaign, 8 Carter Page, from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court or a national security court, that there were multiple streams of intelligence. They were not solely reliant on the dossier. And if you can come back to me for just 1 second, they make the argument in the Democrat memo that after they had the initial warrant for surveillance, they were able to obtain additional intelligence that justified at least 3 renewals for the Carter Page warrant. And that's in this section here, and you can see that the findings were heavily redacted, so those are likely sources, methods, and other national security information. They also make the argument that the National Security Court was told that it was a politically driven or a politically motivated document, and they felt the FBI and Justice Department were in keeping with their standards of shielding sources and methods, and they didn't deviate from that in this case, Molly.
Takeaway here is, the Democratic memo, 10 pages, the Republican memo, 4 pages. Does the release of this Democratic memo, does it actually undercut that initial Republican memo?
Well, there are 2 central findings to the Republican staff memo that was released at the very beginning of this month. One is that the FISA court, the National Security Court, was never told directly that this research in the Trump dossier that was compiled by a former British spy, Christopher Steele, was being paid for, was being driven by the DNC and the Clinton campaign. And the reason that's important is that the National Security Court is what's called an ex parte court, which means only one side is represented. So there's a special burden on the government to present evidence to the court that is very broad. So the court really has all of the information it needs, even information that may undercut some of the intelligence in the application, so that they can make a sort of full and sort of cogent decision on whether the warrant is justified. The other central finding for the Republican staff memo is that former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe in December of 2017 testified before the House Intelligence Committee in a closed session and told the committee that if it hadn't been for this Trump dossier, they would never have sought a surveillance warrant for an American citizen, Carter Page. And this is a very big headline. And when you look at the Democrats' memo today, if you go into the footnotes, you can see that they specifically cite the December 2017 testimony by Andrew McCabe, but they don't pull anything from that testimony to refute the findings of the Republicans.
Yeah.
They pull sections that relate to the circumstances and the intelligence, and that the British spy had a track record for credibility with the FBI, but they don't refute that directly, and I think that's significant.
Yeah, it's interesting what's in each of these documents, and it's interesting what's being left out of each of them as well. So, Catherine, what's the bottom line?
think the bottom line is that with the Democrats' memo, they want people to read it and really look at the trees and not the forest. So really get into the details and into a lot of the weeds here, but not look at the big picture. For most Americans, they're not used to reading stories about this National Security Court, the FISA court, and I can tell you from my more than 15 years of experience dealing with these issues, there is really no higher standard within the judicial system than the granting of a surveillance warrant for an American citizen inside this country for the FBI and other agencies. I mean, there's no higher standard. So in this particular case, it would have been to the benefit of the court to err on the side of fuller disclosure, not less disclosure. The other point I would make is that you have this conflict between the Democrats and the Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee. So you may be asking, is there a third party here which can help us understand to what extent the National Security Court really relied on this dossier? And I think it's important to note that on the Senate side, the Republican chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Chuck Grassley, along with Senator Lindsey Graham, have made a criminal referral to the Justice Department over the British spy Christopher Steele. But in that referral, which has now been declassified by the Justice Department, you can see very clearly that the dossier was the bulk of the application for the surveillance warrant. It was really the top line item. So as a final thought, when you go back to 2017, right about now, really with Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee, it was all about the dossier. Yet here we are a year later, and you have a 10-page memo. And when you read it, they make the argument that, in fact, it was really never about the dossier. It was about other intelligence. And I think that there's a lot of daylight between those two positions. And I'm sure in the next in the coming days, they'll hopefully explain how there is that kind of disconnect or that gap there, Molly.
It's been fascinating. You know, they say you look through rose-colored glasses, but sometimes, you know, sometimes the things are shaded blue or shaded red, and you have to know what you're looking at. Catherine Harris, thank you so much for breaking this down for us throughout the day. We appreciate your analysis. All right, we also heard from President Trump just a short time ago, the White House also releasing an official statement earlier on the Democrats' memo, saying this in part. While the Democrats' memorandum attempts to undercut the president politically, the president supported its release in the interest of transparency. Nevertheless, this politically driven document fails to answer serious concerns raised by the majority's memorandum about the use of partisan opposition research from one candidate, loaded with uncorroborated allegations as the basis to ask a court to approve surveillance of a former associate of another candidate at the height of a presidential campaign. Let's bring in Jeff Mason. He is White House correspondent for Reuters to kind of give us some insight. You know, you've been watching this unfold throughout the day. We finally get a look at the Democratic memo. You've, of course, seen the Republican memo and had some time to ruminate on all of this. Just your thoughts now as you're looking at all of this and the statements coming down from the White House as well.
Well, I think my first thought is that it seems pretty clear that both memos were politically motivated, and this entire thing that we're watching is one of the better examples of political theater in Washington that I can imagine. It's clear that both sides have a different view of what happened, and it sort of gives a challenge to an observer and to readers of both memos to decide which facts, which pieces of evidence, which memos they decide are true. Clearly, the White House position, as you just articulated, is that despite the fact that the president allowed this memo to come out, they don't see it as credible. They believe that the fact that this memo did not get into, or more specifically emphasize, the fact that Democrats were involved in funding that dossier undercuts the other aspects of it. But the memo does acknowledge and says that the FBI acknowledged in its application for that surveillance, permission for surveillance, that the information was politically charged or had come from a political source.
Yeah, you know, as you raise that issue, I want to get a little listen here. This is Devin Nunes, of course, the Republican, the head of the Intelligence House Committee. Take a listen.
One of the things in the Democratic memo that they're all hot to talk about is that in a footnote before the FISA court, they had put in a very convoluted, complicated answer for something that was, and it's buried at the end, okay, of the application, about that this was politically motivated. Wouldn't it have been a lot easier just to say, hey, Mr. Judge, we want to let you know that the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party paid a lawyer who hired a firm who hired a foreign agent to go to the Russians and get dirt on Mr. Trump.
Yeah, you kind of touched on that just a moment ago, but there's one other issue, and Catherine Herridge raised it a moment ago regarding the testimony of Andrew McCabe. Remember, it was mentioned in the Republican memo, this testimony of Andrew McCabe, that this dossier was important, that it was essentially essential towards before the FISA court, and the Democrats had argued that that's not exactly how he said it, that his testimony was mischaracterized. Yet when the Democratic memo comes out, it's not clarified. We don't see the transcript. We'd all love to see the transcript.
Yes,
but the Democrats don't clear that up in this specific memo. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that is a question that is open, and I'm sure that that will be asked in the coming days. However, I think they do, and whether people will interpret this differently, but they do address the fact that Carter paid, that the evidence that was presented for getting a surveillance visa or surveillance permission for Carter Page was not only tied to that dossier, that in fact the FBI was looking at Carter Page months before and had interviewed him months before. So that is certainly part of the response that the Democrats are laying out in this memo as to the justification that was used when seeking that warrant.
Congressman Schiff, he argues the Republican memo omitted and distorted key facts. He was that it was initially meant to mislead the public, and this Democratic memo was supposed to be the rebuttal memo that was meant to show what was left out. Was the Democratic memo, it's released now, could this be, will it be seen as a success? Did they get their point across?
Well, I think that depends entirely on which side you're on this issue. I think that the Republicans, and we've already seen with the response, both from the White House and from others on Capitol Hill, will view this memo as a nothing burger. And the Democrats on the other side will say that this was a very deliberate and point-by-point rebuttal to what came out in the Republican memo, and they will view it as a success. So I think the longer-term answer to that good question will just depend on how people react more broadly in the coming days.
All right, thank you, Jeff, for pouring over all of this. Right now, we're going to bring you back a little later on in the hour. We're going to talk, of course, about the midterm election. It's getting closer and closer.